David Ruggles, practical abolitionist. David Ruggles, 1810 to 49, was born and raised in Connecticut, the son of free parents. He settled in New York in 1828, right after enslaved people were emancipated statewide. Ruggles seized and helped to expand the opportunities that New York afforded to its growing Black community, pushing the city to the forefront of the fight for freedom. So this first paragraph introduces David Ruggles. He was born in Connecticut, and his parents were free, so he was free as well. And he settled in New York. So he moved to New York right after enslaved people were emancipated statewide. So just after the slaves were freed throughout the state of New York. And he helped to grow the Black community, pushing in their overall fight for freedom. When Ruggles first came to the city as a seaman in 1825, Black New York was in a state of transition. Full freedom would not come for another 2 years, but slavery was being slowly dismantled. Growing numbers of free African Americans had created their own neighborhoods, businesses, churches, and schools. So when he first came to the city, he was a seaman, a sailor, and Black New York was in transition. So things were changing. They didn't get full freedom yet. That's not until 28, what we found out from the last paragraph. But it was changing. A lot of businesses were being sprung up by Black Americans, African Americans. So their neighborhoods, businesses, churches, and schools were being developed here. Ruggles' choice of occupation, seaman, was one of the few open to Black men of his generation. There were severe limits on Black life in the city. Most Black men had lost the vote in 1821 when a poll tax was imposed on Black voters. Barred from jobs such as cartmen or longshoresmen, Black New Yorkers often took low-paying, grueling, or dangerous jobs. So his job, his occupation, seaman sailor, was one of the few open to his generation. Now, um, as a side note, a seaman or sailor, it's a dangerous occupation. Um, you needed reliable sailors on a ship to get you from A to B, and an incompetent person is going to get you killed. So this was one of the few occupations where really it did not matter the color of your skin, what you look like. If you were a good sailor, you were valuable. So this is one of the jobs that they actually got a good form of fairness in that job. So while he's in the city, there were severe limits when he got to the city because poll taxes were introduced. And what a poll tax is you needed to pay money to vote. And since most African Americans, Black people at the time were former slaves, they didn't have any money. So if you didn't have money, you couldn't vote. So essentially, they lost the vote. They couldn't vote because they didn't have the money. And they were barred from some of the better jobs, such as cartmen or longshoresmen. These were the jobs at like the ports where you get to unload cargo from ships. So instead, they took on much more low paying, grueling, more physical, and dangerous jobs. Newcomer David Ruggles was committed to fighting slavery, and he carved out a variety of spaces in the city to advance his cause. He opened a grocery store and joined the Quaker free produce movement, selling only food made without slave labor. 6 years later, he opened up a bookshop and anti-slavery lending library. The bookstore was insultingly referred to in one public notice as an incendiary depot, inferring that it was a place that excited factions, quarrels, and even sedition. Ruggles also dove into the New York press world, at first by selling subscriptions for white-owned abolitionist newspapers. Okay, so this paragraph highlights how he was committed to fighting slavery. He did a couple things. He opened up a grocery store, so this free produce movement aiming at offering food made without slave labor. Then a bookshop that was anti-slavery in sentiment here. And critics called it an incendiary depot. So depot is a place where you put stuff, and incendiary means fire. So it is a fire depot. Because they were criticizing this bookshop as a place of excited factions, different groups, quarrels, fights, and even sedition going against things. So they were accusing it as spurring up maybe dangerous thoughts. And if it was a bookstore on anti-slavery, maybe that was actually a good thing rather than a bad thing there. And then he will also drive into the press world, so meaning the media, the press, newspapers, and he started to sell subscriptions to abolitionist newspapers. An abolitionist newspaper is a newspaper with the goal of ending slavery. So their news articles are with the goal of ending slavery, abolishing or getting rid of slavery. Then, in 1838, he launched the Mirror of Liberty, the first magazine founded by an African American. Ruggles' own writing also appeared in pamphlets like The Extinguisher Extinguished, a reply to abolitionist calls for resettling African Americans in Africa. So he would go on to do more things, releasing a magazine, and even responding to certain abolitionist thought. So at the time, uh, abolitionists had a goal of ending slavery, but some of them have different ideas. One idea was that end slavery, and then the African Americans that were living in America right now could resettle or go back to Africa, where their roots were from. And some people believe this was the good way to do it. They can go back to Africa. Others disagreed with this thought. So here it shows that he replied to calls of resettling African Americans in Africa. Since the early 19th century, African Americans in New York also created mutual aid and benevolent societies, providing insurance and assistance to members of their communities. David Ruggles expanded this work into legal aid with the founding of the New York Committee of Vigilance, which focused on helping free African Americans who had been kidnapped and accused of being fugitive slaves. The committee also sought to liberate enslaved peoples. Sorry, I lost it there. The committee also sought to liberate enslaved people who had been brought by their owners to New York. In 1838, Ruggles tried to help Thomas Hughes, an enslaved person who sought asylum after his master, John P. Darg, brought him to New York from Virginia. Hughes was soon freed, but Darg accused Ruggles and two others of extortion. Ruggles was jailed for several nights, though no case was ever brought against him. So this next paragraph really illustrates um, what the African American community did for themselves and some of the dangers that they faced. So they created mutual aid benevolent societies. That just means help each other out type societies. So they provided insurance and assistance to those communities, and he expanded David Ruggles into legal aid, into advising against the law, because at the time free African Americans, some of them that were free, completely legal free, but they got kidnapped by slave owners, and then they were accused of being fugitive slaves, and thus they were brought back to slavery. Or if they were former slaves, and they were brought into slavery if they were never slaves. So that would happen. Free African Americans would have been kidnapped, and if they're kidnapped, accused of slavery, they would become slaves. So he offered legal aid to help fight that. Also, there's another case where he brings up Thomas Hughes. So Thomas Hughes was a slave. He was an enslaved person. And from the state of Virginia, where him and his master was from, slavery was legal. But when he crossed over to New York had abolished slavery, so there was no slavery there. So if Thomas Hughes, the slave, crosses over, he would be free. So So in this case, Ruggles tries to help Thomas Hughes in this situation. Obviously, his master wanted to keep him as a slave, but Thomas Hughes wanted to be free, and they were in New York at the time. By the 1830s, activists and abolitionists in the Northeast had also started to develop a network of safe houses for enslaved people fleeing to the North and to Canada, what became known as the Underground Railroad. David Ruggles was a key contact in New York City, reportedly aiding as many as 600 people to steal themselves and attain freedom. Ruggles called it practical abolitionism. Okay, so this paragraph talks about David Ruggles' participation in what would become known as the Underground Railroad. It was not an actual railroad and it was not underground. What that meant was underground meaning in secret, and a railroad meaning a route that you can go from A to B to get to somewhere. So the route was from the south, which many of the states there had slavery laws, and the North, where many of those states had anti slavery laws. So if you could get yourself, if you're an enslaved person, if you could get yourself to the North in any of these northern cities, you would be free. So David Ruggles became part of this network that helped slaves escape to their freedom. And it shows us here that he was one of the key contacts in New York City. So he was a big player that helped people to get themselves to freedom in New York City. One of the people Ruggles helped was Frederick Douglass, who became one of the nation's leading voices for abolition of slavery. Douglass stayed for several nights at Ruggles' home in 36 Lispenard Street when he first arrived in New York after escaping slavery in Maryland. Ruggles was part of a growing community of Black anti-slavery activists in New York. Unlike in Boston, most of the leaders were men, but women played an important role behind the scenes in providing safe houses that offered shelter to fugitives. So this highlights again Black anti-slavery activists here. So, and it highlights how Ruggles helped one particular person, Frederick Douglass, and he would become a big name in abolition of slavery, trying to get rid of slavery for the whole country. And then this highlights the role of women. They also helped out a lot with the behind the scenes of setting up these safe houses. And the last paragraph here. By 1841, Ruggles' health and eyesight were failing, and he left New York for a radical commune outside Northampton, Massachusetts. In fewer than 15 years in the city, he had helped to radicalize the Black anti-slavery movement and to build an underground network that would, over the next decades, help bring hundreds of enslaved people to freedom. So this is the concluding paragraph. Tells how his health was failing, so he moved to Massachusetts. But it summarizes quickly that in 15 years, he helped to radicalize or charge up this Black anti-slavery movement to get things done. And he helped create that, build that underground railroad that would practical, meaning in real terms, bring over enslaved people or slaves into the freedom that was the North. And this is David Ruggles' practical abolitionism.